Hello and welcome to this latest episode of Yes Labels. Bill Stepien here, as always, joined by Justin Clark. Hello, Justin.
Hey, Bill.
We took a week off. Hope you're relaxed and energized, Justin. We're now officially post-Labor Day. Summer is officially, or maybe unofficially, behind us. I don't know. I have to look at my calendar. But we have exciting news to cover today. We'll be unwrapping and unveiling our monthly South Carolina primary poll and unveiling it to the world through this podcast. And there's a lot of stuff to cover in the poll, a lot of movement. So why don't we just get into it? Makes sense to you, Justin?
Sounds good to me. As our listeners know, we've been polling the South Carolina Republican presidential primary since April of this year, every month. And we've been seeing some interesting trends and interesting stuff going on. I'll just read the question and go through the top line numbers for everybody. So we asked if the 2024 Republican primary election for president was held today and you had to make a choice, for whom would you vote? And no surprise, Donald Trump remains on top with 46%. Nikki Haley makes her first appearance in second place in our poll at 21%. Governor DeSantis remains at 13% from the previous month, followed by Tim Scott at 6%, Chris Christie at 4%, Vivek Ramaswamy at 2%, Mike Pence at 2%, and Asa Hutchinson at 1%, and Doug Burgum within the margin under 1%. What stands out to you here, Bill?
First, Trump's consistency, right? He was at 45 in August. He's +1 to 46 in September.
Highest he's been. Highest he's been in this poll.
Highest he's been. We've been polling for 5 months: April, May, June, August, and September. He's been as low as 38 in May, but he's been in the low 40s, now the mid 40s in the last 2 months. So one is Trump's consistency atop, not just atop the poll, but also just where his number has been. Second is Ron DeSantis, really stuck in neutral, right? He was at his high of 23% in May, down to 18 in June. He's been at 13 in August and September. Really, the most notable jump that you outlined, Justin, is Nikki Haley. She's +10 from August, from 11% in August to 21 in September. So she now sits firmly in second place. 46 for Trump, 21 for Haley, 13 for DeSantis. I look at Haley's number and I'll talk about Tim Scott instead. I think Tim Scott has a major Nikki Haley problem. He was a potted plant on last month's debate stage. I mean, he was in the Burgum Asa Hutchinson category of microphone time. We've said for quite some time that it's likely there's only one South Carolina candidate in the race by the time South Carolina rolls around. And we've talked on this podcast that all signs were pointing to Nikki Haley being the one who would exit stage left. But she's clearly got some momentum. And I think it's important to look at where she's getting her votes from. Where is she picking up her support? It's not coming from Trump voters. Only 7% of Haley's voters would even consider voting for Donald Trump. And to a lesser extent, only 18% of her voters would even consider voting for Ramaswamy. So she's not taking votes from the Trump wing of the party. But she's outright stealing votes from Tim Scott. 72% of Haley's voters would consider voting for Tim Scott. And she's really acting as a wet blanket on Ron DeSantis, and to a lesser extent, Chris Christie. 39% of Haley's voters would consider voting for DeSantis. 34% would consider voting for Chris Christie. And we've talked about this offline, Justin. For those who picked Haley as their first choice, Scott was the second choice for 35%. DeSantis was the second choice for 19% and Christie for 16%. So she's clearly picking the pocket of Tim Scott, and we're seeing him slip from 11% in August to 6% in September. And again, I'll say she's acting as a wet blanket for DeSantis. At a time where he needs to be picking up and moving, he's stuck in neutral, and that's largely thanks to Haley taking votes from him. What do you think, Justin?
So I think that is right, but I'd qualify it here a little bit. I think what's notable about Nikki Haley's rise is that she's basically back to where she was in April of 2023. in our first month of the survey. That was right after she announced. So she had a pop, kind of a big tentpole moment in her campaign, which led to some interest. We saw that decay over time. She went from 19% in April to 15 in May to 12 in June to 11 in August. What happened in August right after our survey? She had a really good debate performance where she was aggressive. She got in fights. She had a fair share of time. She wasn't the potted plant that you talked about. And I think that interest level went back up. Like voters were reminded of her and the things they liked about her. I am TBD, I would say, whether she can sustain that. She wasn't able to sustain the momentum from a pretty good announcement and rollout in April. And we need to see if she's able to sustain that in a way that continues on, that past this poll, past this survey. We have another debate coming up. Her expectations will be a lot higher. I think Tim Scott will have learned some lessons from the previous debate. Beyond the potted plant thing, I think we discussed it in our last podcast or a few ago. Tim Scott really ceded the abortion issue debate to Mike Pence and Nikki Haley. Those two dominated it with their answers. And for a guy who's supposed to be courting and getting evangelical voters, that was a real mistake and a real missed opportunity. We'll talk about the second choice ballot here in a little bit, but he's got an opportunity still, I think. But you're right that Nikki Haley's taking votes from her and from him and from Governor DeSantis. I am just very skeptical that she's able to sustain that 21%, and then growing it, I think, is a whole other challenge that she's going to have to deal with, only because former President Trump's popularity is so high, and she has made it a bit of her issue set to attack him. But he has yet to really engage with her. I don't know where that leads or what that does, but I don't think we need to get there yet, because I think it's a real open question as to whether or not she can sustain that 21%. The other note I would say for this, Bill, and it's not necessarily great news, but this is the first month of our survey since May where Governor DeSantis has not seen a decline in his support, which I think is noteworthy. He maintained his 13% month over month from August to September. Now, from May to August, he dropped 10 points. But it's always good news when a negative trend stops. So just looking on the bright side a little bit.
Yeah, and one more point. You talked about some skepticism, and I would agree with that. If Haley can continue and expand upon this. Voter intensity is really, really important. One red flag to point out: Trump leads among those who are definitely voting in South Carolina. Haley leads among those who will, air quotes here, probably will vote, closed air quote, or are 50-50 on voting. That means her support is much softer. There's much less intensity. There's more ability for it to come and go. So, that hard support for Trump is there. It's immovable. Haley, it can come and go. So to your point, momentum is hard to. She needs to harden her vote a whole lot more than it currently is.
Yeah,
her support, her growth has been built on the backs of people who aren't yet sold on her, aren't even yet sold on voting, to be honest.
Totally agree. Bill, we also ask a candidate consideration question, which I think is really important and often not asked by pollsters.
Yeah.
Why don't you go through what that is and go through some of the numbers?
I will. You're right. We ask something called candidate consideration. Everyone asks, who are you going to vote for, right? And we just talked about the results of that ballot test here. We often have found that candidate consideration is an early indicator for ballot support. Would you consider voting for a candidate before we actually ask the actual ballot question? So we ask a question like this. We're going to read you a list of some of the most likely candidates. Please rate each candidate on a 7-point scale. 1 means that you would almost certainly vote for that person, and 7 means that you would almost certainly never vote for that person. You can use any number from 1 to 7 to rate these candidates. 4 means that you are completely neutral on the potential candidate. We actually saw, Justin, Vivek Ramaswamy have a catapulting consideration figure long before he was ever considered to be a serious candidate on the ballot.
Yeah,
So
this question's a leading indicator, kind of an early warning sign for votes.
Exactly right. So we group we group the 7-point scale on a scale. We group 1 through 3s to have a total would consider voting for a candidate, and then we group 5 through 7 for a total would not consider voting for a candidate. Donald Trump, 63% of South Carolinians would consider voting for Donald Trump. 32% would not. 63-32. Tim Scott, 61% totally would consider voting for Senator Scott. 23% would not. Nikki Haley, 56% would consider voting for Nikki. 33% would not. Ron DeSantis, 54% would. 33% would not. And Ramaswamy, 34% would. 40% would not. Let me just give you some quick movement, Justin. I'll start with where I ended. Ramaswamy saw his total would not number jump 9 points from 31% in August to 40% in September. So 40% now are saying they would not consider voting for Ramaswamy. Quite a big jump. Nikki Haley, 11% growth on her total would consider voting, up to 56% from 45. Her would not was down 8% from 41 to 33. And Trump also saw some positive movement from 61 total would in August to 63 in September. What do you think about all this, Justin?
Well, I think this is telling for us. And the reason being, as you said, it's on a 1 through 7 scale. So one of the measurements we like to do is look at the mean number and how it's moving from month to month, right? Is that number getting closer to 1 or is it getting closer to 7? And that change that you mentioned for Ramaswamy, going from a 31% not consider to a 40% not consider, is really telling. It moved his mean number from a 4.3 to a 4.6. After a debate performance that I think everybody agreed was kind of uneven, after some stories that came out that weren't great, we might be starting to see the flash from the pan dim. And that not consider moving that high for him is a real problem. People were, back in June, May, people were giving him some decent consideration. We're going to give him a chance. And now they've seen something and they clearly didn't like it. Similarly, but the flip side, Nikki Haley, who had a pretty high mean on the 1 through 7 scale. She was at a 4.2. She was on the wrong side of the curve there. Has now started dragging her mean number back to a 3.8, which is actually pretty good. It's better than Governor DeSantis's for the first time. He's at a 3.9, and that doesn't just mean that consideration exists, but it's an indicator that these numbers are hardening a little bit. And this may be the sign that she's planting herself at her number in South Carolina. And I'll be really interested in our October poll whether that movement continues for her or not, because I think that'll help answer our last question as to whether or not she can sustain these numbers or grow them. And those are obviously the two big movements. The other thing to note, Bill, and I think we mentioned this last time, is that as numbers don't move, it means people's determination is hardening. And who didn't move this time? Other than Vivek and Nikki Haley, really nobody else except for Donald Trump, who moved from that 61% to 63% for people who would consider voting for him. I don't know what's in the minds of all of these voters, like specifically, but boy, this sure looks like people are making a decision that, okay, I think he's going to be the nominee. I'm with him if he is.
Yeah. Among those who said one, right, the almost certainly will vote for this candidate, Trump is at 42%. among people saying I will almost certainly cast my ballot for this person. So that is a hard and large number, and saw a growth of 1%.
It's it's really quite something. Um, so why don't we run through? We obviously test issues on this race or on this poll, and a lot of this stuff stays static when we ask questions like this, but there's been some movement, and I think it's telling kind of what we're seeing. So I'm going to read through our question, which we asked, which is, which of the following issues do you consider most important right now? Very open-ended question. We give a list of potential topics. So in our poll in September, the top issue was stopping illegal immigration at 29%, jobs in the economy at 29%, ensuring election integrity at 20%, defending life and the pro-life cause at 8%, stopping rising crime at 5%, protecting the Second Amendment at 4%, and unsure at 6%. Bill, before I kick it to you, I just want to note stopping illegal immigration has jumped 6 points since our last poll in August to tie for the lead in terms of top issues. Jobs in the economy has remained the same, roughly the same at 30%, and everything else has remained fairly stable. But what do you make of those issues, Bill?
Couple observations. You see some massive age breaks, which probably isn't surprising when you look at which age groups consider which issue to be most important. Jobs in the economy tied with stopping illegal immigration at 29% in the survey. Massive age breaks when you look at South Carolina's youngest voters and South Carolina's oldest voters. Probably not a surprise here. Those younger voters, 18 to 44, 44% of that younger age break cited jobs in the economy as the number one issue, 44%. Only 10% of those age 65 plus said the same. Only 10% of seniors said jobs in the economy. Not a surprise, I guess, but still a massive age break to note. Similarly, immigration. Those 65 plus, 37% cited illegal immigration as their number one issue. Only 10% of 18 to 44 year old voters said the same. Only 10% said illegal immigration was their biggest issue. So major deviation between age groups on issues 1 and 2 in the poll. Looked at income as well. Those who earned $50,000 or less per year, more than twice as many of that income group care about immigration than jobs in the economy. 33% cared about immigration most. Only 15% said jobs in the economy. Conversely, those who earn the most in the state, $100,000 or more, their number one issue is jobs in the economy, 37%. I think that probably has more to do with traditional Republican values, Justin, in their bank accounts. Um, but I found those income breaks to be pretty interesting. And I think it's also interesting to look at where each candidate's voters fall on the issue spectrum as well. Trump voters, 33% said immigration was number one, 31% said ensuring election integrity was most important, 18% said jobs in the economy was their number one issue. Look at Nikki Haley's voter profile. Of Nikki Haley's voters, those who are supporting Nikki Haley in this race, 42% said jobs in the economy, 25% said immigration, only 8% said election integrity. So there's a major break between Trump voters and what they deem is most important and how Nikki Haley's voters view the world. And Ron DeSantis' voters, by the way, are right in between. 33% said jobs in the economy, 31% said illegal immigration, 16% said election integrity. So I found the deviation not just on age or income, but also among each candidate's supporters and what they feel to be pretty noteworthy, Justin.
Yeah, that again, we keep seeing these breaks on income and age, and they're super interesting and are pretty telling. And, those are also pretty decent indicia of who is going to vote in terms of like reliability of someone actually showing up for a primary. One thing I want to add on this bill is, and I don't want to get into this question because there's not a ton interesting in here, but we do ask the question about which candidate has the strongest or best position on each of the following issues. And it really is pretty highly correlated to what the actual top line ballot is. No surprise, Donald Trump leading who's the strongest or best among all these issues. But what I found interesting was and indexing right to his number. The economy, 49%, national security, 48%, immigration, 51%, Second Amendment, 43%. What I found interesting was on pro-life causes and abortion, he was at 31%, and Nikki Haley was at 24%. So if we want to get an indicator of Nikki Haley's bump and really where it came from, it's got to be that abortion question that she answered that really knocked out of the park at the last debate, and that went viral. That is a pretty big break from where the top line ballot numbers are, and Trump, if there's one place where he shows some vulnerability, and we saw it in some interviews this week, it would be in that area. Now, he is in such a strong position, I'm not sure that can really affect him in a negative way, especially if you see someone like former Vice President Pence take the issue and run with it. And he's someone with such a high, a poor candidate consideration score that it might not matter. But this is an interesting break in terms of pro-life politics in South Carolina. I think it's going to be super interesting where the party lands on this and where the primary audience lands on this.
No doubt. I talked a little bit earlier about, I delved into the second choice question a bit. We asked a standalone second choice question in the poll. We obviously asked who would be the survey respondents' first choice. We also asked who the second choice would be. The second choice of those in South Carolina that we polled, Ron DeSantis topped the group at 23%. Ron DeSantis was the second choice of 23% of those that we polled. Tim Scott was second at 17%. Nikki Haley was the second choice of 15% of those that were polled. Ramaswamy, 14%. Donald Trump, 7%. And I'm sure you'll talk about that. Chris Christie at 5%. And then Pence, Hutchinson, Burgum at 3%, 2%, and 1%. Thoughts on the second choice question, Justin?
So I'm going to start with former President Trump. Like you said, that 7% number really stands out. Not super surprising. Anyone who doesn't have an opinion on Donald Trump in September of 2023 has either been living under a rock or I don't even know how else you describe someone who doesn't have an opinion about Donald Trump at this point. The interesting part here is I don't know if this indicates a resistance to Trump, meaning that second choice is only 7%, or there are so many in the first choice column or that approve of, like him, that it doesn't matter. But that's a very interesting number to see and to watch, because if people are formulating their second choice already, that indicates, the potential for a break from the top can go somewhere. And it's a number the Trump campaign should be concerned about and should be working on. And at this point in a campaign, it would make sense for them, having consolidated a lot of support. And we haven't seen his number move off of that mid-40s number in quite some time.
Justin, how do you do that? How do you, if you're the Trump campaign, how do you work on that? That requires some level of, I guess observation that you aren't the first choice of some people, which takes some degree of understanding and acceptance to realize. I think it also requires some sophistication, right? Probably requires some data and a little more nuance. How do you, if you're the Trump campaign, how do you go after second choicers?
Well, honestly, like, and this might not have been on purpose, but maybe you start trying to appeal to more mainstream Republican voters. And again, this might not have been on purpose, but the former president's answer when asked about the 6-week abortion ban, or asked about the abortion bans around the country by Kristen Welker this weekend, might be the way to do that. Kind of de-emphasizing some of the social issues that have really bogged down politics over the last 50 years in this country. And bogged down, I don't mean to disparage anybody, but it's really dominated politics over the last 50 years. And a lot of people just don't like talking about those things, and that's fine. But getting it out of that area of the world, getting it out of that mindset and that issue set might be helpful. Another way to do it is, figuring out now that you're kind of off to the races and we're getting closer to election day, figuring out a surrogate plan to get people who are more like those voters that we're talking about into those communities, talking to them, whether it be through digital means, radio, whatever, but a robust surrogate plan that appeals to those voters. In 2016, I mean, Bill, you remember this, it was Ivanka Trump in Eastern Pennsylvania, President Trump in Western Pennsylvania. And we hammered it with everybody. And it worked. And you had that kind of Trump-Toomey map in 2016 that resulted from it. So a lot of those kind of more nuanced things. In terms of data, I'm not even sure there's massive data analytics to do right now on this for him. But starting there would probably be a good spot. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Donald Trump, I think the Trump campaign, we've been a part of a couple of them. So maybe we're a little biased. Maybe I'm a little biased. I don't think they get enough credit for some of the sophistication and nuance. I think oftentimes the Trump campaign is seen, is viewed as a sledgehammer. They do one thing and they do one thing only. They have one message and one message only. They do rallies and rallies only. But I think there's a lot of churn under the surface. And there's a lot of nuance that the campaigns have exerted over the years, including this one, that often goes unnoticed. So I think you're right. I think all the things you said regarding how you do it and what's been done in the past is true. But I do think I think that I mentioned this. I think there needs to be an acceptance that, hey, there's still more votes to be had. There's still more votes to mine, um, and to actually want to go after them.
Yeah.
And not kind of turn your back on those who may not be your first choice, which some campaigns with a high mind maybe want to do.
I totally agree with that. One other thing on the second choice ballot that I thought was interesting is Tim Scott came in second place in the second choice ballot at 17%, which way over indexes his ballot number, which is at 6%. And if you look at who those voters are, 84% that say Scott would be their second choice come from one of three candidates. Nikki Haley, 44%, Donald Trump, 36%, Ron DeSantis, 15%. What's interesting there is it's a wide ideological grouping that most of those voters come from. And to have a good chunk of Haley voters and a good chunk of Trump voters is pretty interesting. He does really well with voters who are 45 to 64. He's evangelical women. What I would say too is that almost a third of the voters who say Scott is their second choice put Governor Haley in as the best person to handle the pro-life abortion issue, which I discussed before, that she way over-indexed on. I think that's really interesting. And I think what this sets up for Tim Scott, and again, that debate performance really, really, really hurt him, because it's almost like people want to support him. People want to Tim Scott and getting him over the hump to do what we've been saying for months, which is make some news. He's going to have to do something eventually. Is right there. He is a strong potential candidate here, and we're seeing that with these second choice numbers. We're seeing that with who likes him, and we're seeing that on the life issue. He's just got to do it, and he's got the money. He's got voters who are interested in him, and he's got to do it because we're not seeing those movements in candidate consideration like we saw last time, or last couple of months with him. He's got to do something.
This is the first month we asked that question, correct?
Yes.
I really wish, and we'll ask this question moving forward, I would assume. I really wish we had asked this previously because I would like to have seen this question's results last month.
Yeah.
Because I wonder if Scott's first choice has moved into second choice, then it would be a whole lot less impressive to me. But
I agree.
We'll see what next month shows.
Well, we also, for the first time this month, asked a question about the vice presidential selection.
What?
Yeah, sure did. Your name is not on the list. I didn't want to have it be too high of a number on the poll, so we didn't include you. But we asked, of the following options, who would you like to see as Donald Trump's vice presidential running mate were he to secure the Republican nomination for president?
Who are the top three?
The top three, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, governor of Arkansas at 20%, former gubernatorial candidate Carrie Lake at 12%, and Senator Rand Paul at 12%. What do you think of that, Bill?
I think it's way too early to be asking this question. I'm not sure why you asked this question. It's ridiculous, but I think it's super interesting. And a good discussion point.
Somebody who I won't name his name thought it was a good idea. It rhymes with Bill Stepien for all you listeners out there.
We did not. I think one important thing to mention, we did not ask anyone who's currently running for president.
Correct.
Whether they would be a good vice presidential candidate. So if you're currently running for president and your name was not mentioned in the top three, don't have your feelings hurt. We only chose those currently not running for president. Sarah Sanders, we worked with Sarah in the White House for a couple of years. She has a pretty good foundation, right? Her dad was governor of the state where she currently governs. He had a TV show. He ran for president, even won the Iowa caucuses back in, I believe, 2008. So that's a pretty good foundation from which to start, right? And she kind of earned cult status. We saw it firsthand for the way she took on the White House press corps. Was super prepared, was super smart at the podium. She was on TV most afternoons and a lot of evenings, defending the president, defending the party, defending the agenda. Now she's a rising star as the newly elected governor of Arkansas. So I think she's got a lot going in her favor. So I guess I'm not surprised to see her number where it is. You mentioned Carrie Lake and Rand Paul. You know, Rand Paul was pretty interesting to me. We know he has a good relationship with the governor, the president, President Trump, rather. We know that he's has as well earned status in the party as a real conservative and a real defender of the agenda in the Senate. I thought there were pretty interesting breaks between Rand Paul for VP supporters and Sarah Sanders for VP supporters. Those who picked Sarah Sanders, they were 65 plus voters, older voters, especially females. They were non-college educated voters, especially females, and they were evangelical voters, especially females. You sense a trend there. If you picked Rand Paul for VP, you were a younger voter, 18 to 44, especially male. You were a college graduate, especially male. So there were definite breaks between who was standing up for who on that question. We also asked, we obviously have a crosstab among Trump voters. If you're supporting and voting for Donald Trump in South Carolina, this same question was obviously asked, and the results were pretty interesting. The results were a lot closer, right? You mentioned among all voters, 20% said Sanders, 12% said Paul, 12% said Lake. Among Trump voters, 25% said Sanders, 24% said Kerry Lake, 10% said Rand Paul. So there was definitely a different response rate among those who were supporting Donald Trump in the race. So it's certainly way too early, obscenely early to be asking this question, but I think the response were certainly pretty darn interesting, Justin.
Well, I agree. I think a couple things that stuck out to me beyond what you said. Kerry Lake, a former gubernatorial candidate in a state, having this kind of name recognition in a forced choice is pretty interesting to me. I mean, she has turned her failed gubernatorial bid in 2022 into celebrity, and that's pretty hard to do. I want to touch on Rand Paul. Obviously, you mentioned Sarah Sanders. Like, I love Sarah. We worked with her at the White House. She's great. She has a lot of name ID and built that brand. I think the Rand Paul thing is the most interesting to me here. You mentioned the demos that really are appealing to him, and it's not surprising. He is kind of the current intellectual backbone of the president's foreign policy agenda, which is, get out of foreign wars and entanglements. I mean, he's leading the charge on ending the war in Ukraine. He is, you mentioned the president's agenda, but in terms of his foreign policy agenda, is probably the most closely aligned senator to him on that front, and isn't new to the party. He has been saying these things and doing these things for years, and has built up a brand for himself in that lane of the party. That kind of like Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul into Rand Paul that led to Trump's foreign policy actually as an elected president in the Republican Party. He kind of represents that change. I think it's also pretty telling to me that he is, it's not telling, but in surveys we've done, you and I have done around the country, like Rand Paul's got really good name ID among Republicans and is pretty popular. He's not a guy who fakes the funk here. He kind of tells people what he thinks, has a core set of beliefs, and goes by them. I think it is way too early to say these things, but I think it is pretty telling what it is. And by the way, Bill, you mentioned who Trump supporters preferred. It might, one of the things to attract people who are not necessarily Trump supporters yet might just be picking someone or flirting with someone who they don't prefer and building them up, kind of
Smart.
Get a little addition to the party on this stuff.
Smart. Anything else to cover on the poll, Justin? I think those were the things I wanted to talk about.
Those are things I wanted to talk about too, and we'll release a bunch of this stuff over the next couple of days, so everyone who goes on Twitter or whatever will be able to see it.
Well, that about does it. This is my obligatory reminder to like, subscribe, comment, share, do all the things with your friends related to the podcast. Justin, great job as always. Audience, thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.